The world watched in astonishment as Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The United States, under the Biden administration, responded with unwavering support for Ukraine. This support was multifaceted, encompassing military aid, economic assistance, and diplomatic backing on the world stage. The US condemned Russia's aggression in the strongest terms. It rallied international partners to impose sanctions on Russia. Moreover, the US stood firm in its commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. This steadfast support continued for over 2 years, bolstering Ukraine's resilience in the face of Russian aggression. The US provided Ukraine with billions of dollars in military aid. This aid included advanced weaponry such as Javelin anti-tank missiles and HIMARS rocket systems. This military assistance proved crucial in enabling Ukraine to defend itself against a larger and better equipped Russian military. Beyond military aid, the US also extended substantial economic support to Ukraine. These economic lifelines helped to stabilize the Ukrainian economy and alleviate the humanitarian crisis caused by the war. However, the international landscape began to shift subtly. The global impact of the war, particularly on energy prices and food security, started to bite. Some countries, particularly in the global south, expressed growing frustration with the lack of progress towards a negotiated settlement. This changing geopolitical landscape set the stage for a significant shift in the US's position on the Ukraine war. February 26, 2025 will be etched in the annals of history as the day the United States seemingly shifted its stance on the Ukraine war. The setting for this dramatic turn of events was the hallowed chamber of the United Nations General Assembly. For the first time since Russia's invasion, the US voted against a UN resolution condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. This vote sent shockwaves through the international community, signaling a potential change in the geopolitical calculus surrounding the conflict. The US's decision to break ranks with its allies and abstain from condemning Russia marked a stark departure from its previous unwavering support for Ukraine. Since the invasion in 2022, the US had consistently voted in favor of 6 similar resolutions condemning Russia's aggression and affirming Ukraine's sovereignty. The US had been a leading voice in rallying international condemnation of Russia's actions and mobilizing support for Ukraine. This sudden shift in the US's voting pattern at the UN raised serious questions about the Biden administration's long-term commitment to Ukraine. The US decision to abstain was not an isolated incident. It came on the heels of a series of subtle but significant shifts in its rhetoric and actions regarding the conflict. In the months leading up to the UN vote, US officials had begun to emphasize the need for a negotiated settlement to the war. They stressed the importance of finding a diplomatic off-ramp even as they continued to provide military and economic assistance to Ukraine. The US's decision to abstain from the UN resolution condemning Russia was further complicated by the presence of a competing resolution on the table. 2 distinct resolutions, each embodying a different vision for peace, were presented to the UN General Assembly. The first resolution, backed by Ukraine and its allies, aimed to hold Russia accountable for its actions. The second resolution, spearheaded by the United States, sought a more immediate cessation of hostilities, even if it meant compromising on accountability. The Ukraine-backed resolution, supported by 93 countries, directly addressed the root cause of the conflict, Russia's full-scale invasion. It condemned Russia's actions in no uncertain terms, reaffirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and demanded the complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. This resolution reflected a principled stance against aggression and a commitment to upholding international law. It aimed to achieve a just and lasting peace based on respect for international norms and the right of self-determination. In contrast, the US proposed resolution, titled The Path to Peace, initially omitted any mention of Russian aggression or the need for accountability. This omission raised concerns that the US was prioritizing a swift end to the conflict over addressing the underlying issues that led to the war in the first place. The initial draft of the resolution focused primarily on achieving a ceasefire, facilitating dialogue, and addressing the humanitarian consequences of the war. While these are all laudable objectives, the omission of any reference to Russian aggression or accountability raised concerns that the US was willing to appease Russia at the expense of Ukraine's legitimate security concerns. The US's decision to abstain from condemning Russia and to propose a resolution that initially omitted any mention of Russian aggression sent shockwaves through the international community. The Biden administration's justification for this dramatic shift in policy centered on the need to prioritize peace over accountability. US Deputy Ambassador Dorothy Shea argued that previous resolutions condemning Russia had failed to stop the fighting and that a new approach was needed to break the diplomatic deadlock. Shea emphasized that the US remained committed to supporting Ukraine, but believed that a resolution solely focused on condemning Russia would be counterproductive. She argued that the US proposed resolution, with its emphasis on a ceasefire and dialogue, offered a more pragmatic path towards ending the bloodshed. This explanation, however, did little to quell the anxieties of Ukraine and its allies, who saw the US's move as a betrayal of trust and a sign of waning resolve. The US's decision to abstain from condemning Russia was met with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Critics argued that the Biden administration, under pressure from domestic political forces or concerns about the global economic fallout of the war, was seeking a way to extricate itself from a protracted conflict. They warned that by softening its stance on Russia, the US risked emboldening Putin and undermining the rules-based international order. The US's shift in policy, whether driven by a genuine desire for peace or a calculated strategic recalibration, has undeniably altered the geopolitical landscape surrounding the Ukraine war. It remains to be seen whether this new approach will lead to a negotiated settlement or simply embolden Russia to escalate its aggression. The coming months will be crucial in determining the long-term consequences of this pivotal moment in the conflict. Section 5. Ukraine's plea. A just peace, not appeasement. Ukraine, caught in the crosshairs of shifting geopolitical winds, responded to the US's perceived abandonment with a mixture of disappointment and defiance. Ukrainian officials acknowledged the US's continued support, but expressed deep concern that prioritizing a swift end to the conflict over accountability would ultimately undermine the prospects for a just and lasting peace. They argued that appeasing Russia would only embolden it to continue its aggression, setting a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister Mariana Betsa delivered a powerful speech at the UN, emphasizing that peace could not come at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. She warned against rewarding Russia for its aggression, arguing that doing so would only encourage further violations of international law. Betsa's impassioned plea resonated with many countries, particularly in Europe, who shared Ukraine's concerns about the dangerous precedent that appeasing Russia would set. Ukraine's stance is rooted in the bitter lessons learned from history. The appeasement of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, often cited as a cautionary tale, emboldened Hitler and paved the way for World War II. Ukraine and its allies fear that a similar dynamic is at play today. They argue that Russia, emboldened by a perceived lack of resolve from the West, will simply continue its aggression until its expansionist ambitions are satisfied. The Ukrainian people, having endured unimaginable suffering and hardship, remain resolute in their determination to defend their homeland. They are acutely aware that any peace agreement that compromises Ukraine's sovereignty or territorial integrity would be seen as a betrayal by Russia. The international community now faces a moral and strategic imperative to ensure that any peace settlement is not a mere pause in the fighting, but a just and lasting resolution that upholds the principles of international law and the right of nations to self-determination. Section 6. Shifting Sands, the view from the global stage. The US's shift on the Ukraine war sent ripples of uncertainty across the global stage. For many countries, particularly in Europe, the US's move was seen as a betrayal of trust and a sign of waning resolve in the face of Russian aggression. The European Union, which has stood shoulder to shoulder with the US in supporting Ukraine, expressed deep concern over the potential implications of this policy shift. The US's decision to abstain from condemning Russia at the UN, coupled with its pursuit of a peace deal that prioritizes a ceasefire over accountability, has strained relations with key European allies. These allies view the US's actions as a dangerous concession to Russia that could undermine the rules-based international order. The fear is that the US's shift in policy will embolden Russia and other authoritarian regimes to believe that they can act with impunity on the world stage. The US's change in approach has also exacerbated existing divisions within the NATO alliance. While some NATO members, particularly those in Eastern Europe who feel most threatened by Russia, remain steadfast in their support for Ukraine, others are increasingly wary of the economic and military costs of a protracted conflict. This divergence of views within NATO threatens to weaken the alliance's unity and effectiveness in deterring Russian aggression. Beyond Europe, the US's shift on Ukraine has been met with a mixture of reactions. Some countries, particularly in the global south, see the US's move as a pragmatic step towards ending a conflict that has had a devastating impact on the global economy. Others, however, view it as a cynical attempt by the US to advance its own interests at the expense of a smaller nation. The US's decision to prioritize a ceasefire over accountability has raised concerns that it is willing to sacrifice principles for the sake of expediency. Section 7. The future of Ukraine. A nation at a crossroads. The future of Ukraine hangs precariously in the balance as the geopolitical landscape surrounding the war continues to shift. The US's decision to abstain from condemning Russia at the UN and its pursuit of a negotiated settlement have injected a new level of uncertainty into the conflict. While a negotiated settlement remains the most desirable outcome, the terms of any such agreement will have profound implications for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and future security. A peace agreement that compromises Ukraine's sovereignty or territorial integrity would be seen as a betrayal by Russia. It would also set a dangerous precedent, signaling to aggressors worldwide that they can achieve their objectives through military force. The international community must therefore ensure that any peace deal is not simply a pause in the fighting, but a just and lasting resolution that upholds the principles of international law and the right of nations to self-determination. The US's shift in policy has placed Ukraine in a precarious position. While the US continues to provide military and economic assistance, the prospect of a negotiated settlement that could involve territorial concessions has left Ukraine feeling increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russian aggression depends not only on its own military capabilities, but also on the continued support of its international partners. If the US continues to push for a negotiated settlement that involves concessions from Ukraine, it risks undermining its own credibility as a guarantor of international security and emboldening Russia and other authoritarian regimes to pursue their revisionist agendas. The Biden administration must weigh the risks and benefits of its current approach carefully. It must ensure that any peace agreement does not come at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Section 8. The global chessboard, power plays and uncertainties. The Ukraine war has become a focal point of a broader geopolitical struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not just a regional conflict, it is a direct challenge to the rules-based international order that has governed relations between states since the end of World War II. The US's shift on the Ukraine war, therefore, has implications that extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The US's decision to abstain from condemning Russia at the UN and its pursuit of a negotiated settlement have emboldened China, which has been steadily strengthening its ties with Russia. China sees the US's perceived weakness as an opportunity to advance its own geopolitical ambitions. It has been increasingly assertive in its territorial claims in the South China Sea and its threats towards Taiwan. The US's shift on Ukraine has also emboldened other authoritarian regimes around the world who are watching closely to see how far they can push their own agendas without provoking a strong response from the West. The war in Ukraine has become a test case for the international community's willingness to defend the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of law. The US's decision to prioritize a ceasefire over accountability in Ukraine risks undermining its own credibility as a global leader and emboldening authoritarian regimes around the world. The Biden administration must articulate a clear and consistent strategy for dealing with Russia and other authoritarian challenges. This strategy must be based on a firm commitment to defending democratic values and the rules-based international order. Section 9 towards an uncertain resolution, hope amidst the ruins. The Ukraine war, now in its fourth year, has inflicted unimaginable suffering on the Ukrainian people and destabilized the European security order. The US's recent shift in policy, while aimed at finding a diplomatic solution, has injected a new level of uncertainty into the conflict and raised concerns about the long-term implications for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As the world grapples with the prospect of a protracted war, the need for a just and lasting peace has never been more urgent. The path to peace in Ukraine is fraught with obstacles. Russia, despite suffering significant military setbacks, remains intransigent in its demands. Ukraine, bolstered by the resilience of its people and the support of its international partners, is determined to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Finding a compromise that satisfies both sides will require skillful diplomacy, unwavering international pressure on Russia, and a willingness from all parties to make difficult concessions. The US, despite its recent shift in policy, remains a critical player in the search for peace in Ukraine. The Biden administration must leverage its diplomatic weight to bring Russia to the negotiating table in good faith and ensure that any peace agreement upholds Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The US must also work with its European allies to provide Ukraine with the economic and military assistance it needs to deter further Russian aggression and rebuild its shattered economy. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy for all involved. It is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the fragility of peace in the 21st century. While the path to a just and lasting resolution remains uncertain, the international community must remain committed to diplomacy, dialogue, and a peaceful resolution that respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The alternative is a protracted conflict with devastating consequences for Ukraine, Europe, and the wider world.